After the Velvet Revolution of 1989, Czechoslovakia embarked on a journey as a democratic republic that later dissolved into the Czech Republic and Slovakia. The newly gained freedom of expression and movement within a capitalist environment of the new countries has clearly demonstrated itself in a local cinema. According to film scholar Jana Dudková, Slovak cinema became the most obvious part of the transition processes to capitalism when it transferred itself from the old narrative and ideological patterns to new aesthetics, genres, or topics. The restrictions on what could be filmed were lifted. Directors could obtain funds for their projects from private sources, meaning the role of the state has thus nearly disappeared from filmmaking. One of the most apparent examples of the new wave capitalist cinema is the second film in the Fountain for Suzanne trilogy. Filmed in 1993, the film completely threw away the narrative of its cult predecessor and adapted the story to the Slovak reality at the time, adding foreign elements that were not prevalent in the communist cinema. The director, Dusan Rapoš, took on making one of the first contemporary gangster movies of the Slovak cinema, a genre that was later left untouched up until the late 2000s. Fountain for Suzanne 2 is about Suzanne, who after getting out of prison tries to restart her life. She meets a truck driver and travels around Europe while slowly falling for him. The truck driver ultimately quits his job and pursues a career as a rock star due to the gangster activities associated with the background of the trucking industry. This hinders his relationship with Suzanne, as he is now surrounded by women obsessed with him and he succumbs to the rock star lifestyle. Due to the strange genre mixing, this gangster musical was universally panned by critics, yet it is very important in the history of Slovak film. Fountain for Suzanne 2 is a wild expression of freedom, utilizing all the possible stereotypes of its era. Everyone wears jeans, smokes Marlboros, the characters travel around Europe, and society is troubled by criminals far wilder than any iteration of mafia in Central Europe at the time. These themes are prevalent in other movies from the time period, one of them being the third installment in Sun and Hay trilogy. Sun, Hay, and Erotica is a movie about a small Czech village in the middle of nowhere trying to reinvent itself to become more European, part of the developed Western world, rather than an underdeveloped village holding on to the past. The characters travel to Italy, the cars are mainly Western and rather expensive, computers are everywhere, and the influence of West can be felt throughout the movie. The collective character of the villagers is the equivalent of Suzanne, a representation of Czechoslovakia as a country with newly gained freedom that is moving forward from its past. While Suzanne literally gets out of the jail, some of the villagers get to leave their birthplace for the first time in Sun, Hay, and Erotica. The theme of movement is ever present, and the characters never seem to stop moving. They drive cars, trucks, buses, and ultimately they all boldly move forward towards brighter and better futures. The movement is obvious from the style of both directors. They showcase technologies that were rarely available and used during the previous regime. The crane shots, rail shots, and even helicopter shots are a new addition to Czechoslovak film that showcases the move towards westernized filmmaking, transcending the film themes into the actual image. This move towards more westernized themes and cinematic style, however, lacked a sense of continuity with the Czechoslovak filmmaking past. Both the filmmakers and the characters within the films like Fountain for Suzanne 2 and Sun and Hay and Erotica looked into the future uncritically. It only took a few years for a certain skepticism towards the new capitalist regime to form in the filmmaking community. In 1995, the sequel to the film She Grazed Horses on a Concrete was released. The main character of Horses on Concrete, Johanna, works at a local village farm that is falling apart after the collapse of communism. She is taking care of her granddaughter while trying to save the life of her daughter. Similar to the first installment in the series, Johanna is portrayed as a strong central character. While in the first movie she only had to deal with the collective character of the village that hated her due to being a single mother, she now has a political regime to fight against. She mentions that she doesn't understand the regime anymore, that she feels like she has no life guarantees due to instability of capitalism, and that she lost her job security. While the mise-en-scène of the first capitalist movies is retained, as Coca-Cola, new cars, and electronics are everywhere, the style is far simpler. Most of the shots are simple, static, medium-long shots. The cuts are rather quick and glue together seemingly unrelated events in a slightly unorganized manner. This style is closely related to the more traditional Czechoslovak cinema, rather than the capitalist new wave. The main stylistic device that serves the early onset of mild nostalgia for the older days is the use of flashbacks. The movie opens with one and continues to use them rather heavily throughout. The filmmakers use edited footage from the first film to both express Johanna's nostalgia as well as contextualize some of her decisions. Johanna is not the only film character who gets lost in the capitalist regime and longs for better old times. One of the prime examples is Stepan, the main character of the Poet series. The first installment filmed during capitalism, The End of Poets in Czech Lands, centers on Stepan's struggle to survive in capitalism, and a criticism of the regime is rather strong. This is done not only through the story itself, but some of the stylistic choices. Similar to Horses on Concrete, the movie is mostly composed of medium-long shots, except for the montages of the city changing during the capitalism, with fast spinning shots and jump cuts that stand out. The confusion that Stepan experiences while being lost in the newly developed capitalist power structures is clearly demonstrated through the use of the aforementioned montages. His longing for the former regime is very vocal, and he constantly refuses to take part in a changing society. Stepan's character is the closest to developing full-blown nostalgia for communism, but it was rather early for the directors to fully explore a communist past, as the society has not fully recovered by that point. The rest of the films from the 90s continue the trend of exploring the nostalgia lightly through the criticism of capitalism without ever actually portraying the past. By the new millennium, the use of nostalgia had fully developed in the respective cinemas of the Czech Republic and Slovakia. It was around that time that the society started to become more comfortable with the communist past, and films set in 1960s and 1970s started to surface. One of the first films, now a cult classic, is Cozy Dance by Jan Hřebejk. Released in 1999, it was a story about two families with different political ideologies celebrating Christmas while living in an apartment building together, and established what would become a de facto genre on its own. The families experience a conflict that is a direct representation of what was going on in the country at the time, the Prague Spring. During this time, the entire political system was undergoing a change as freedom of speech and movement was introduced. The movies analyzed in this video essay are always directly related to these two core freedoms that were in place for a short period in 1968 and were taken away after the forceful invasion by the armies of the Warsaw Pact. Cozy Dance, being set at this period of time as well as being the first of many movies about communism, brought about a few themes that can be observed in all the other movies set in this time period. The movie opens up with a clear depiction setting up two opposing characters. While one of the fathers is seeing off his Russian visitors, the other one comments on the situation by saying that he expects the Bolsheviks to be done in a year, two at the most. The main characters can be simply called the communist and the capitalist, two neighbors in an endless conflict based on their ongoing political struggle, just like the rest of the country at the time. The nostalgia sets in with the Czech Big Beat song in an intro and continues throughout the film.
Co ti budu hrát.
Muzika is a Slovak answer to Cozy Dance. Filmed in 2008, 9 years after its main inspiration, the film offers a Slovak take on a portrayal of normalized communist Czechoslovakia, being set sometime after the Prague Spring. Regardless of its predominantly comedic genre, Muzika manages to explore the themes of nostalgia in a much more depth than any predecessor and builds on the themes introduced by Cozy Dance. It is rather obvious that neither of the films is nostalgic for the regime itself. Cozy Dance portrays the actual attitude towards the regime through one of the main characters, the proponent of the communist regime who is ultimately a caricature of a human being. He is obsessed with central planning of his own household and technological advances of the communist sister countries. In Musica, the imagery of communist Czechoslovakia is cold from the very first moments. The narrow spectrum of color associated with the images depicts the oppressive side of the regime. The establishing long shots of industrial buildings and their interiors are the witness of the decay under the communist regime and essentially demonstrate the half-life of the communist Czechoslovakia. The color scheme is usually on the side of gray, which not only serves the purpose of depicting the regime in a negative light, but stays true to the appearance of communist architecture. Cozy Den follows the suit and portrays communist regime through similar lens. The buildings are dated and bland, while the overall tone is slightly warmer. The similar use of imagery can be observed in other movies such as Identity Card, a coming-of-age story about 4 teenagers and their families, and The Confidant, a story of a government agent going rogue. In both of these films, the buildings are usually rather bland-looking with a cold coloration. This imagery is complemented by the rather predominant image of the border. Usually shown as a combination of barbed wire fence and watchtowers, it is one of the main expressions of the regime's oppressive nature. In Musica, the border police patrol causes trouble in the citizens' lives, shutting down any activity that is suspicious and not according to the strictly prescribed communist values. This image serves the story as it foreshadows both the difficulty and even impossibility of escape to the West. The Confidant, being from the same director as Musica, takes on a very similar portrayal of the border, while in the Identity Card, the family of one of the main characters directly interacts with patrol police while trying to escape the country through the false pretense of going on a vacation, leading to a very tense and emotional scene. Cozy Dens, on the other hand, does not portray the border through any imagery, but as some of the main characters escape, it is a concept that one is aware of. The border and the oppressive regime are responsible for limiting citizens' movement and are the main cause of the stasis the characters of these movies suffer. The families and friends are portrayed in long scenes in which they are gathered together, either discussing something or just mindlessly sitting and meditating on life. The atmosphere of these films is thus rather slow. Not much seems to be happening as life itself appears to stop moving, just as the characters tend to point out during these scenes. Most of the Cozy Den's story happens during the family visits, and the characters spend a good amount of time sitting down. Most of the story is portrayed through rather simple medium shots, and the director uses movement, mainly rail shots, only to smoothen the transitions between scenes. In Musica, the stasis and the desire to break away from it is well portrayed by the scene where the male protagonists are hunting a mole, something that is causing disturbance under the surface. They are trying to smoke the mole out, ready to take action, but they fail miserably. In the Identity Card, the 4 main protagonists gather on a hill behind the city and hang out aimlessly. When the family of one of them tries to escape the country, as demonstrated in a scene shown previously, the dad gets a brain aneurysm while being interviewed by the party and becomes completely static as he is confined to the bed. The internal struggles of the characters are demonstrated through their desire to escape their lives in the country itself. In Musica, this struggle materializes itself through the main character, Martin Junec, who jumps on the first opportunity to escape his mundane life and attempts to become a musician. He is stuck at a dead-end job, living in his in-laws' house with a wife that suspects him of cheating on her. He buys a saxophone and starts a journey that will temporarily turn his life upside down. In The Confidant, the main character is forced into working with the party as one of the agents collecting information on all the possible rebels. Once he finds out he himself is being targeted, he becomes a rebel who ends up escaping the country after seeing the way regime ruins everyone's lives. The capitalist neighbor in Cozy Dens constantly comments on his hatred towards the regime and ultimately manages to escape the country during his honeymoon. Whether these escapes are successful or not, they are the desired outcome of one's situation. This is how the nostalgia demonstrates itself. It is all about the missed opportunity for a personal rebellion that would snap one out of ordinary. According to Frederick Jameson, nostalgia films restructure the whole issue of prestige and project it onto a collective and social level, where the desperate attempt to appropriate a missing past is now reflected through iron law of fashion change and the emergent ideology of the generation. This mesmerizing new aesthetic mode itself emerged as an elaborated symptom of the waning of our historicity, of our lived possibility of experiencing history in some active way. Muzika's Martin has a chance to escape his life and rebel against traditional values when he meets Ancha Pichachka, a slightly insane girl who couldn't finish high school and is now making parachutes for the Czechoslovak army. When Martin is shown with his wife Marfa, they are usually alone in a frame, constantly arguing about some petty thing that she came up with, especially as she initially hates his music. His scenes with Ancha are the complete opposite. Not only does she appreciate his music from the get-go, she is a free spirit and his muse, who completely disregards any rules. Their scenes are dreaming. It is difficult to determine which ones are real and which ones are only fragments of Martin's imagination. Ancha embodies the possibility of escape. She is the little bit of freedom in a completely outlined life that Martin is living. Martin's other escape, what keeps him from being tied down by the regime, is his music. On more than one occasion, the characters around Martin are not sure what kind of music he is playing, whether it's Western or not. The Border Patrol notes that the music is something that the Austrians over the border could hear. Martin manages to escape the country without physically getting away. His love affair coincides with the efforts to escape the country with his band, and he is on the verge of leaving his life behind. In A Confidant, the main protagonist, Adam, erases parts of the recordings that he's supposed to obtain, and also attempts to help a Polish pilot that is trying to escape the Eastern Bloc. The capital is within Kozidens uses any opportunity to express his hatred of the regime. He screams from his balcony at the top of his lungs on multiple occasions, and he's constantly bringing up his hatred in conversation. The identity card is full of small rebellions by the main protagonists, whether it is shaking a policeman's hand too hard, tearing pages within their identity cards, or ultimately making up reasons to avoid the conscription. It is a story of the rebellions of young men. These small and common rebellions are what directors are nostalgic about. Fighting against a common enemy within an oppressive environment with set rules, where even the tiniest thing could have gotten one in trouble. The desire to achieve freedom is more often than not left unfulfilled, and thus these acts of rebellion are the only way characters can feel free. In reality, the desire for freedom has materialized through the Prague Spring for a brief period of time before things went back to the communist normal. Very much like the Prague Spring, Martin's affair with Ancha and Muzika doesn't last long, and he ultimately ends up back with his wife, just like the country that went back to communism. In Kozidens, the actual Prague Spring takes place, and after the invasion of Warsaw-packed armies, even the communist character feels betrayed and attempts to take his own life. Muzika, the Kozidens, Identity Card, and A Confidant are characteristic examples of the Czech and Slovak tragic comedy genre set in a communist past. They are funny because they do not portray the regime favorably and are quick to offer struggles of those affected by communism. The nostalgic feeling comes through the association with personal rebellions and missed opportunities to break out of the ordinary. The nostalgia tied to the missed opportunities transcends the time period the films are set in. The approach directors take when portraying the communist regime can actually be applied even if the film is set in not so distant past. I'm All Good, released in 2008, is the first film that follows the likes of Kozidens and Muzika, yet it is set in post-revolutionary Czechoslovakia. I'm All Good is a story of a small neighborhood within Prague that simply took a break after the regimes changed. It follows a group of friends that is slowly adjusting their lives to capitalism while playing cards and drinking beer. The first half of the movie is a definition of slow cinema in the Czech Republic and Slovakia. Nothing happens and the characters are waiting for something to snap them out of this life. The grand event comes in the second part of the film, when the group of friends decides to retrieve money lost by one of them while gambling with the gypsies. The speed of the film picks up as the characters find the enemy to fight against, and doesn't slow down until the very end. The main character, Tonda, notes that there is nothing to fight for anymore, no common enemy that is threat to one's life. In each film, the emptiness left behind the failed and disruptive communist regime leaves people confused and causes them to become static. The nostalgia within all of these films comes from the fact that directors desire to relive the past, whether that is the Prague Spring or the fast and confusing 1990s that have brought about huge changes and a large amount of uncertainty. Czech and Slovak cinema is ultimately nostalgic for these lost years that no one can bring back to be lived again.
Bolo to takto, celú noc som nezažmúril oko. Chytila Lama ľahká nespravosť.